It's an extraordinary honor to be invited to this festival. Anthony goes to too many, and he's decided that this is his last occasion to talk about this book after a year of travel. But we're saving up for this event. And I think I need to apologize first, because I love Anthony's parents, I love his 2 children, I love his dog, I love his wife. We go on holiday together. This is not a casual professional pairing. We're very close friends to the extent that I went to visit his new house in Umbria, and I spent a week digging a new hedge for him. But the second apology is because we're both passionately interested in history. He told me about this project, and I said, on no account do this book. This is absolute disaster, and you should reject this and go back to what we love you for, the Levant, for Egypt, for an exploration of something you've explored and dug into in the last 9 books. And I'm a professional publisher, and I'm delighted to reveal to you this is by far his most successful book that's been translated into how many languages?
13 so far.
13 so far. And being a good friend, suffering from Schadenfreude, and as the translation contracts came in, I found it incredibly difficult to settle down and read this book. And what happened is, after Boxing Day, I opened it in slight irritation, and I found myself totally gripped. All the things that I thought he couldn't achieve were done, and I know some of these landscapes, and my God, his talent as a writer is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary world journey, and Anthony, shall we begin with the beginnings, with your description of Göbekli Tepe and perhaps the division of mankind, humankind?
Yes, Göbekli Tepe is the beginning of the book, and for good reason. It is the most important archaeological site on the planet at the moment. And it is in southern Turkey, not far from the Syrian border. It was only discovered in the 1990s, and it's still being excavated today. So there's only so much we can extract from it. We don't know the people who built the place. We know very little about exactly why it's there. But it's a series of T-shaped pillars, about 10 or 12 feet high, a dozen of them in a circle, 2 bigger ones in the middle, and not just one circle, but lots and lots of circles. And these are cut out of limestone, single blocks, and moved in 9,500 BC. This is 7,000 years before the Mesopotamians were building ziggurats or the Egyptians were building pyramids. And lots of circles. And actually, since I wrote this book, they've discovered another site nearby, which has exactly the same thing, called Kurhan Tepe. And no doubt next year, the year after, they will find something else. So there's a full culture here. We don't know why they did this. It was a sacred site. This is the beginning of building temples. But in the process of building this place, these were everybody on the planet then, and that's why I start the book at that point. Almost all of us lived mobile lives. There weren't towns, there weren't cities, but in the process of building this place, of cutting the stone, you need more than you could possibly maintain as hunter-gatherers on that site. And so we have the beginning of cultivation, the beginning of domestication of food, because basically they'd eaten everything they could eat around there. They're still hunting animals. They're still brewing beer. One of the things they found is this huge trough where they brewed beer, and they were clearly getting drunk for some religious purpose to commune with their gods.
But are we certain about beer?
We disagree about this, but Klaus Schmidt, the man who discovered the site, assured me that they were making beer. He also assured me his dating was right. But anyway, whether they were brewing beer or not, whether they enjoyed a pint or not, is not the point. This is probably why humans began to settle. And if not at that precise site, then somewhere like that, nearby and around that time. And in order to live a settled life, you need to have a regular supply of food, and therefore out of settlement comes agriculture. and out of agriculture comes social structures that we all accept today. Ancient Egypt being the obvious example, where you have a pyramid structure because of the peculiarities of the rise of the Nile. You need the entire population ready when the Nile floods. It only happens once a year. It doesn't rain at any other time in the year. And so you have the ruler on the top, the pharaoh in that case, and you have the priestly caste, you have the military, and then you have the bulk of everybody underneath getting on and doing their lives. And that's how we live today. So everything that we know of our lives, of our settled lives, is there predicated at the beginning.
I've also had the extraordinary good fortune to sail down the Nile with Antony's wife Sylvia, a brilliant Arabist, hearing the stories. And one of the most powerful evenings of my life was hearing you talk about Seth and Isis and Horus and the pairing of Cain and Abel. And I wonder if you could share that with the audience.
Yes, well, all our early mythologies, wherever they are, in some ways reflect this connection and also the division between the settled and the nomadic. And so, for instance, in ancient Egypt, you have the god Osiris, who is supposed to be the good king, who teaches the Egyptians how to be good farmers and how to be good citizens. And his brother becomes the lord and later the god of wilderness and of travel. He is the nomadic god. But you also find it in the earliest recorded narrative we have of Gilgamesh. This very, very early Mesopotamian story, where you have Gilgamesh, who is the king, who lives behind his walls, who proudly says, "Look at my wall. The gods have helped me build this." And you wonder whether they're to keep people out or to keep people in. And on the other hand, there's this natural force that is sent against him, a figure called Enkidu, who the gods send as a counterpoint, who represents our wild, mobile self, who runs with the animals. And the story, I'm sure many of you know this story, Gilgamesh sends a woman called Shamhat, who's a temple priestess, but maybe also translated as a prostitute, who goes and stands by the watering hole waiting for Enkidu to come with the animals, and she undresses when he arrives, and he's never seen a woman before, and they have epic sex for weeks, and at the end of which he is no longer fit to run with the animals, and therefore he has to shave. They cut his hair, they dress him, they give him a sword, and then he is ready to live what is called the civilized life. But the story, as it plays out, is this immense loss that humans have at giving up that natural side, which is the mobile side, the nomadic side.
But also the choice of the deity, choosing between Cain and Abel's offering of sacrifice on the altar.
Yes, Cain and Abel. It's much more complicated because it's never quite clear. This is obviously the foundational story of the first fratricide in the Christian tradition, the Judaic tradition, is between the settled and the nomadic. One is a nomad, one is a settled, and their god favors the offering of the nomad, who is then killed by his brother. Out of jealousy. Well, it's never quite clear why God favors the offering of one and not the other.
And the punishment of the brother who murders is to be turned into a wandering nomad himself and to be restless.
Yes. Well, into a wandering person. But I think it'd be good at this point just to define exactly what we mean by nomad, because the literal original sense of nomad, and it's a very old Indo-European word, goes back to the right to, or the need to pasture, which would suggest you would need to have animals with you in order to be a true nomad. And whether it's camels in the desert or horses on the Mongolian steppes or sheep and goats in the Levant, I mean, that was the definition of a nomad, somebody who therefore also doesn't wander happily. I mean, we have this very romantic notion about about nomads, the free life, you're not tied down by anything, but actually you are absolutely tied down by the need to feed your animals. And most nomads, on the planet today, and there are still millions and millions of them, are moving between places they know, between their summer and winter pastures, whether it's going into the desert in the winter and coming out in the summer, or whether it's going, as I write about the Bakhtiari tribe in Iran, who I spent some time with at the beginning and the end of this book, and they've been doing this at least 1,000 years, maybe they claim a lot longer, but I can't find any sources for that. But they move from the Mesopotamian plain where they spend the winter, because up in the mountains it's covered with snow, but as soon as the snow melts up in the mountains, the grasses are burning down on the plain. The animals have nothing to eat, so they make this extraordinary migration. There was a fantastic film made in 1922, which is very early for a documentary, of the migration of the Bakhtiari, where 50,000 people are moving 500,000 animals up into the mountains. I mean, it's really, really epic. And it was made by the guys who then went on to film the original King Kong. That was their next film. But nomads first, okay?
And the paperback edition has got this very identifiable figure from Scythian gold culture. And this book embraces the world and looks at transhumance and nomadism in all the continents and geographical corners of our world. But there is one uber space for the triumph of nomadism, which we connect, perhaps ignorantly, with the Scythians. Could you?
Yes. Well, between Hungary and China, that huge expanse of Asia, is the northern part is grassland. You can't farm it. It's too cold in the winter. It's too hot in the summer. But somebody calculated if you left Hungary as the snows are melting at the very, very beginning of spring, you could ride a horse the whole way to China before the winter sets in. So it is a corridor, and it's a corridor that I find absolutely fascinating. So it does play quite a big part in my book. Because from around 200 BC to around 200 AD, when on the eastern end of the steppes, you have the Roman Empire. This one of the foundational empires of the Western world. On the other side, you have Han China, the great Chinese empire. And nobody writes about what's in between. It's like, well, this space that is bigger than the Roman Empire. But it's a blank, and we're not taught about this in school. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book is because I wanted to read this book, and I had thought that Bruce Chatwin had wrote it, because his first book was called The Nomadic Alternative. But he didn't. I mean, well, he didn't for problematic reasons that it was too complicated for him to write it as a first book. But I thought, how can we not know about this? And on the western side, you have the Scythians, who are the people who created this decoration that's on the front of the book. And the British Museum had an exhibition about 4 or 5 years ago on the Scythians. It was a major exhibition. We went together. And I remember saying, Scythians? I mean, who's going to go to an exhibition about the Scythians? Hands up anybody who's ever heard of the Scythians. Yeah, okay, you're very good. yeah, you don't
That's
count.
Jaipur.
You don't count. I've asked that question so many places. Normally I get one hand. Okay, so the Scythians, we don't even know what they called themselves, because the problem with writing a book like this, but the problem with being a nomad is you tend not to write history, and you don't leave monuments behind, except a tomb. And so, you leave very, very little trace behind. But there are lots of things we know about the Scythians now, and the British Museum put on a very good show. And on the other side, at exactly the same time, up towards China, in the middle of this huge space, in what's now Kazakhstan, you have the Altai Mountains. Eastern side of the Altai Mountains, you have a tribe called the Xiongnu. Again, we don't know what they called themselves. They definitely did not call themselves Xiongnu because it translates as illegitimate offspring of slaves. And I don't know any nation that will willingly choose to call themselves that. So again, we have no idea what they call themselves, but mostly what we know about them are from Herodotus, the Greek historian, and from the grand historian of China. The descriptions of the people are identical. The way they live, identical. The burials that have been found, in the last 100 years, there's been a lot of excavation done. The grave goods, they're all, the elders on both sides are being buried with Persian carpets, Chinese silk, gold from the Roman world. So this is a connected area. And this is the go-between between ancient Rome and ancient China, and probably also ancient India. William Dalrymple might disagree.
And for those of us who struggle in our love affair between Britain and India, there's a very moving sensibility that we're all equal heirs of some lost Indo-Aryan migration. And although I adore Stonehenge and think of it as my primary monument, it's clear that my ancestors were not the builders of Stonehenge. They're the same people, probably, as your ancestors who destroyed the Harappa civilization in the Indus or swept away. And there's a tremendous linguistic unity in your book in that chapter. It's very powerful.
But it's, this is the beginning. Why don't we know more about this? I mean, when the British Museum had their exhibition, all the world experts on Scythians had a 3-day conference. And there's almost nothing they can agree on because there's so little information. And my editor, after 4 years of working on this book, by which time I was supposed to have delivered it, said, well, what's the problem? And I said, I think I'd underestimated the difficulty of writing about people who don't have records.
I was happy to hear who's having problems with this mega history. There's also, it is an argument about mobility, about movement, about international connections. But there is a savagery, because we're talking about cavalry empires, and we're talking about the people, when they came to the British Isles, who sort of wiped out the indigenous population. And wherever they came in the world, they imposed themselves as a military aristocracy, or not.
Well, one of the problems of writing about them is inevitably we rely on their opponents to tell us about them, and that might not be the most objective way of looking at it. Yes, when nomads appear in our histories, and I studied history through to the age of 18, and at the end of which I could name check 3 nomads: Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, and Timur or Tamburlaine, all of which who were presented as killers. And nothing else. There's no suggestion that they have any other feature worth talking about, any other character. But for the majority of the last 12,000 years, the relationship between settled and nomadic has been A, very happy and peaceful, and B, absolutely interdependent, because they need each other. So for instance, 2500 BC, in ancient Sumeria, in Mesopotamia, but what's now Iraq, there's texts where farmers are worried after the harvest, will the nomads come? Because they need the nomads to bring their animals to come and crop the fields, eat the stubble, and leave their droppings and fertilize. And then they need them to go away. And that's a sort of perfect example of the interdependence. But nomads also need to sell things to settled, and therefore they need markets. And if you look at it, I mean, the historical, almost all of the times when nomads get upset and rise up and rise out of their places and out of their normal pattern of behavior, it's because they've been denied access to markets. And so, for instance, with Attila the Hun, the Roman Empire falls because the Romans keep on reneging on their agreement on markets.
It's also very complex, Anthony, isn't it? In the extent, because of this symbiosis, the very powerful empires borrow the techniques of the mounted cavalry of the steppe land. And there's a very gripping account of the expansion of the Achaemenid Empire taking over your beloved ancient Egypt, taking over the whole of the civilized Near East and making the first great empire and fusion of peoples in the world. And can you reveal the story
Yes.
when they try to include the nomads in this.
Yes, so the horse is domesticated up on the Pontic Caspian steppe, on this steppe land above the Caspian Sea, and therefore obviously the people who do that are nomads, and it gives them a huge range. Until then, they'd been reliant on oxes who move very slowly and simply don't have that range. And we should also mention climate change, because when the climate changes, nomads do get moved down off the steppe. And that's when you see them coming down into India, down the Indus Valley, when we see them coming into the Middle East, because of climate change. There's a drying up. But
Tell us about Cyrus and his attempt.
Cyrus, yes. Okay, well, this is the Scythians again. So you'd imagine, so the whole Persian Empire, and if you've been to Iran, this becomes very obvious once you get there. Iran is not a country that can do very much agriculture. It's, it's either high desert or it's mountains. But it's very, very good for nomads, for herders. There was a great Melvyn Bragg in our time on BBC Radio 4 about Persepolis, which is the great city of Persia. And he obviously hadn't read his notes properly, because at one point he says, so at what point do the Persians stop being nomadic? And there's an awkward sort of shuffling among the three academics who are there and say, well, they never stop being nomadic because they can't. But when they build their empire, and Cyrus the Great is the one who builds it, they do move against other nomads, and he moves against the Scythians, and there's a battle. Scythians have a queen at that point, and I mean, it's quite difficult doing research into women in deep history, because generally it's the men who get written about. But here we have a queen called Tomiris, who says to him, you don't want to cross the river and fight us, because you just want blood, but we want peace, and we don't need to do this. And the battle finally ends. Tomiris' son is killed. She therefore decides to fight, and Cyrus the Great loses his head. And famously, according to the way Herodotus reports it, she then has his head brought to her, and she puts it in a vat of blood and says, now your bloodlust will be sated. But Cyrus' successor, Darius the Great, then 700,000 men apparently he marched against the Scythians, and the Scythians just keep on moving away from them. And eventually Darius sends a very fast herald to go and talk to at this point, king of the Scythians, and say, why won't you fight? I mean, either stand and fight, or pay me tribute as your sovereign. And the Scythian king says, we have no need to fight you. We have no cities that you can destroy. We have no crops you can burn. Why would we fight? We're just doing what we always do. We're moving. And in the end, although Darius claimed that he had conquered the Scythians, and in his famous inscription at Bisitun, he says he went after the Scythians, and he never conquered them. He didn't. And we went to Persepolis together. There's this famous image of all the subject nations to Darius. But the Scythians are the only ones shown still carrying their weapons.
And you mentioned the lack of, inevitably, of women in the historical accounts. Nomads are difficult enough to find. This is pure speculation, but we're in India, one of the great sacred places of the goddess, where that has never been expunged from our sort of psychic, spiritual identity. But undeniably in Western Europe and most of the world, the patriarchy was totally dominant. And it's a random speculation that can't be answered as a historian. But do you see the plough and the seed as a sort of phallic imagery that helped the dominance of men? Or do you see the rampant bull covering the whole herd as the primary source?
I love that question, the phallic plough, raping the soil. Yeah, I think, yes, patriarchy seems to have come with settlement. And again, coming back to Egypt, which I know well, and also I'm trying to write a book about, the beginning, Egypt is probably, when they're worshipping moon gods, they are still either happy to have both, or it's a matriarchy. But as soon as there's settlement, the narrative is the role of the man, and women are second place. But in nomad societies, in the great Mongol Empire, with Genghis Khan or Timur, women are absolutely prominent, and that then plays down here into India with Babur, who says he never made any decision without first consulting his grandmother, who always was right on matters of strategy and things like that. So, it does play down.
And there's also, well, thank you for that, but there's also an amazing sort of insight into the power of the Central Asian nomads. It's clear there's no ethnicity. People get drawn into this space. And there's a very sort of harmonious balance between the dominant rulers of nomadic societies and the people. They live in the same style, they travel in the same carts. There's a wonderful image you have of Attila the Hun about to destroy the Roman Empire, still eating from the same bowl as the herdsmen that are working with them.
Yeah, that's
There's
right.
that charismatic unity and inequality.
Well, it's also a knowing who you are and where you're from. And I think that wasn't show on the part of Attila. He's got all these great cities, but he wants to live in a tent. When he entertains what we would call royally. Everybody eats off gold or silver dishes and whatever, but he's still eating plain grilled meat out of his wooden bowl because that's what he wants. He knows who he is, and it's the same with Genghis Khan and almost the same with Timur. But particularly with these with the Mongol empires, which I think are fascinating. I mean, there've been some really brilliant books in the last 10 years about them. One of the things I love about it, and partly this book was my Brexit protest, because we live in a world where walls are going up all over the place. But when you look back at history, when you take a big view of history, you see that all of the great times, all of the times when humanity flourishes, when things move forward, happen when you have freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and freedom of conscience. And for the Mongols, the Mongol world was absolutely based on that. They didn't care whether you were a Muslim, a Hindu, or whatever. It really didn't matter. You were welcome, so long as you came with the right spirit.
The sort of tautology in your book is that both of us are slightly obsessed by books and learning and libraries and colleges and madrasa. And you have to confess that your heroes, the nomads, are unlettered, apart from one wonderful scene when you strum on Ibn Khaldun being welcomed into the protection.
Yes, Ibn Khaldun, who's a 14th century scholar who starts out, he's from a family that had been very important in Andalusia, and he falls out of favor with the court in North Africa, goes and hides in a castle in what's now Algeria, a Berber castle, and writes his introduction to history. And it is an amazingly radical piece of work, because he's just looking back and saying, why do empires rise and why do they inevitably fall? So he's taking the big look at history. And for him, the purest form for a human to be is a nomad, preferably deep in the desert or high in the mountain, somewhere where the environment is really harsh. You only have what you can carry. You're entirely dependent on the natural world, and you are entirely in tune with the natural world. And yet, out of all these empires he writes about, they inevitably, if you have an empire, you need to have a capital, and when you have a capital, you have a palace, and when you have a palace, you have a wall, and then you are cut off from the people who got you there in the first place, and within a couple of generations, you become vulnerable to the next wave. This is his view of circular history, that it keeps on repeating itself. And what comes out of it, what I take out of it, is the absolute necessity we have of firstly remaining in touch with people and not hiding behind walls, but also being in touch with the natural world.
That's lovely, and this is an argument in favor of nomadic culture, but I'd like to ask you, which level of hell would you put Timur for his destruction of his known world as a nomadic leader, Hulagu Khan for destroying the great libraries of Baghdad, Babur for preying on India. these are the great triumphant captains of the nomadic forces.
I have been accused of being an apologist for these mass murderers, and clearly they did kill an awful lot of people. But I would say, and hear me out, that was what people did in those days. The Crusaders, when they marched into, for instance, into Constantinople, a Christian city, killed an awful lot of people. When they moved down into the Holy Land, there was a huge amount of blood and torture and rape and pillage. It's what people did. But I think inevitably the reports are written by settled people. And so, for instance, Timur destroying Baghdad. Baghdad, within 10 years, is probably the major trading center of the world. So it would suggest to me that he didn't kill everybody.
It's streets running red with blood. It's rivers black with the ink of 1,000 years of scholarship.
Written by the people who were suffering. And I'm not suggesting that there weren't an awful lot of people killed, and he probably did make a pyramid of the heads of people he'd killed and build it outside the city. But I think he didn't kill everybody in Baghdad. I think he didn't destroy every building. I think because he reckoned. And why did he go into Baghdad? This was one of the things I found fascinating researching this book. Nomads are absolutely hopeless at doing siege warfare for the simple reason that every nomad fighter has 2 or 3 horses, which need a lot of fodder. You can't do a large siege when you've got maybe 100,000, 150,000 horses that need to be fed. So what they always did was they arrived and they said, send out your elders, pay tribute, we will appoint a governor, one of us, and you can carry on with your life. And if you don't, we will destroy your city. And my interpretation of what happened is they needed to punish people who didn't come out so that the next city down the line would open the gate.
I grew up with horse-loving parents who really much preferred and were much more obsessed by the condition of the hooves of their ponies. And where's Barnaby? Why is he not helping with the stables? The boy's reading again. So I'm still not convinced, but this incredibly wonderful book is at its best about symbiosis and the mutual blending of these cultures. Because I know Anthony very well, and I think you mentioned on it, was it a personal reaction to what you consider as the horrors of Brexit? It's a sort of clarion call for internationalism.
Yes, well, as I said, I mean, I really do think all the best things have happened in history when we have been able to move freely, when we've been able to trade freely, and when we've been able to learn from each other. It doesn't seem to be a terribly complicated thing, and I think my response to Brexit, the largest act of national self-harm in modern history, is borne out by that. So yes, I'm an unapologetic, thank you, I'm an unapologetic champion of internationalism, of open borders. And I was talking actually only yesterday about this in another place, and somebody said, but we can't just let everybody come in, they'll overwhelm us, and that's what's said in England as well. And I say, well, people come because they think they can make a better life with you, and I don't think that's particularly bad. And if they can't make a better life, as we've seen in the UK, they go elsewhere. People follow the money.
And also knowing you well, I come from a family that moved, 14 generations. We moved perhaps 100 yards a generation, unburdened by books or knowledge. And I know from your personal family history that you are Ashkenazi, only been in London a tiny blink of a second, 3 generations. And you are the most passionate anti-Zionist Jew I know, apart from Avi Schleim, who's hiding in the corner over there. And there's no mention of your expertise of the Levant, but I couldn't help feeling that the book stops too short. In many ways, this internationalism has a personal ingredient for you.
Yeah, yes, it does. But I don't want to write about myself, or at least not in this sort of book. and yes, you know, my origins are, you know, what's now Ukraine, Russia, Germany, Poland, whatever. But that's, you know, that's might be in my blood, but in myself, I'm very much a European, and I look with European eyes, and I think Europe has done wonderful things and terrible things. But I do think that, to repeat this point, that the best things that have ever happened when we can move freely and we can share our experiences. And yeah, I just want to come back to your comment about the Mongols destroying libraries. They also moved libraries. They also moved somebody like Tusi and his observatory because that was important to them. They didn't kill all the scholars. They moved them into new places because it was their world. In the same way that, you know, eventually we'll empty out our European museums and libraries and give it to the next great power because, you know, as our star is descending, others are rising.
You also speculate, I mean, in a very, very attractive way, which makes this book a sort of a blueprint or perhaps a life raft about the role of nomadism, of self-sufficiency. I mean, climate change, the one thing that's going to benefit is it seems likely at the moment the grasslands of Central Asia are going to expand again. But in conversation, you've been very fluent about their role.
Well, I think, you know, nomads are at the forefront of feeling the effects of the climate emergency that we're in because they have animals and they have to feed their animals. So, well, I'm not sure your comment about the grasses on the steppelands works the whole way across. In Mongolia, for instance, the majority of nomads in Mongolia have had to give up their nomadic life because winters are now so hard. Horses were always really great to herd in Mongolia because they with their hoofs they could get through the ice to the grass underneath. The winters are now so severe they can't do that, and in the summers now so hot the grass is burnt out. So the majority of nomads now in Mongolia are living in tent cities around the capital, Ulaanbaatar. So these are people who, you know, anywhere in the world are feeling the effects of climate change. 50% of us now live in urban environments, and the majority of that 50% of the global population live in apartments, and therefore with not any direct access to being able to put their hands in the ground. By 2050, it will be 75% of all humans will be living in an urban environment. When it gets hot, we just turn the air conditioning on. When it gets cold, we turn the heating on. You know, so we can mitigate that. But actually, we can't, and it is something we all need to be aware of. So one of the reasons I like talking about this book is to make this point. And you know, since writing it, I've changed my life. I bought land, which I've never had before, and we have the Rogerson Memorial Garden. But I have also, you know, the week before last, I planted another 8 trees, and it gives me immense pleasure. I've never done this before. It's really changed my life. And you know, and I make a point of writing in the morning and trying to go out in the afternoon just for a little bit, and then I'm still there when it gets dark because firstly it's captivating. It's why do I not know this? Why do I not know how to grow things? And yeah, anyway, that's my story.
We've just got about 5 minutes for a couple of questions, but just one more question. The international, we all wish and desire and live in great cities that are expanding everywhere. Do you see that as the final warped evolution of nomadism? Is none of us have a homeland and we are all going to waft from metropolis to metropolis?
Yeah, in the 1960s, there was a great book by Lewis Mumford called The City in History, which I read a long time ago and has always stayed with me. And he was already in the 1960s talking about the problem of the megalopolis, you know, and will this be the end of mankind? And well, here we are 65 years later. And I'd say, yeah, if we go on like this, it will be the end of mankind, or at least it won't, because somehow or other we'll always morph sideways. But this is not a good way forward. Just as I think, you know, we're now living in an age where borders keep on going up, you know. But one thing that Nomads and my book will tell you is that Donald Trump is not going to win by building his wall. The Chinese built the Great Wall of China to keep the Xiongnu out. It didn't keep them out. In the end, they had to negotiate.
Thank you, Anthony. Do you want to take 2 questions before?
If we have time. Any questions? Gentleman here. There's a microphone coming. There's a microphone coming.
Since we are in Rajasthan, could you talk about the Rabari tribe and the Roma gypsies?
I purposely didn't write about the Roma gypsies because Isabel Fonseca wrote such a brilliant book about them and talked here, actually, I think, about 6 years or 8 years ago, probably, given COVID. I have spent a little bit of time with nomads here in Rajasthan. But I think, from my understanding, is they're under the same pressure as nomads everywhere, and that is the government would like them to settle. They do play a part in the economy, and they produce milk and meat and whatever else. But there's always this thing about nomads, whether it's here or in Europe or anywhere else, and that is a distrust of them because, well, very often they're accused of running drugs or guns or whatever else. They'll rape your daughters. Where have they come from? Why have they come? When are they leaving? But governments, and I, as I said, I write about the Bakhtiari in Iran, but everywhere I've been and all nomads I've spoken to, it's exactly the same. Governments wanting them to settle. And the offer is, well, you're old people. We could give them medical care, but they need to come to the clinic. And your children, you want them to live in the modern world, so come and educate them. And the children go to boarding schools in Iran, for instance. They have boarding schools, and then they never go back to the mobile life. So, yeah, all nomads are under pressure from governments to settle.
Room for perhaps 2 more questions.
Gentleman here in the front with his hand up. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for that talk. You mentioned that patriarchy accompanied settled societies, and I was wondering, for you, what was it about settled societies that gave rise to the patriarchy?
It's a really big, complicated story, and something that the radical anthropology group at the University of London cover really, really, really well. And all their stuff is online. But they look at hunter-gatherers in Africa now who are still matriarchal. And it does seem to be that with settlement comes patriarchy. And maybe because with settlement you need to put up your barriers and say, this is my land. And at that point you need your fighters.
One more question from somewhere over there.
Do we have a question over there? Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm currently writing on Ibn Khaldun and the impacts of climate change as we go forward. What would be your prescriptions on the nomads of the future, the entire immigration, multiculturalism debate?
Yeah, well, and I presume you mean digital nomads and people like that. Yes, I mean, well, digital nomads, they're not nomads. Let's be clear about it. I mean, they're no, because you need to have animals, and just with the fact that they can move, as my late much missed agent Gillian Aitken said, they're not nomads, they're just restless, but obviously, I mean, there are going to be billions of them, in the next 10 years, because people can move around, and you can therefore do a better paid job, but living somewhere where it's cheap, and therefore save money, and I understand all that. The impact is, well, I mean, it's no greater than everybody going on holiday, getting on a plane, and our annual in Europe, our annual migration, sort of. Muslims go to Mecca, Europeans go to the Mediterranean once a year to pray to the sun god. It's the same. The impact on the climate is obviously disastrous, but I don't see anybody stopping that anytime soon.
Thank you, Anthony, for a very insightful talk. we see a decline, a gradual decline in nomadism. Climate change is also one of the triggers, even as you spoke about it being, something which is accelerating. What would be the loss in case nomadism as a way of life disappears?
Well, one thing we haven't mentioned is my this great line from Professor Felipe Fernandez Armesto from Oxford and Princeton, who describes history as a path picked through ruins, which obviously is perfect because it rules out nomads completely. The only role they have, because they don't build monuments, is to destroy as the creator of ruins. And with this old-fashioned way of looking at history. But I think he also says the most successful and enduring way of life that humans have enjoyed is hunter-gathering and nomadism. It was there long before we settled. It was there long before we created Göbekli Tepe, long before the Egyptians had built their pyramids. And they're still there today. There are millions and millions of nomads and transhumans in the world today. And I'm confident they'll still be there long after our cities have crumbled.
On that wonderful note, thank you, Anthony.
I'd just say, as this was my last talk on nomads, thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Really, really.
Thank you very much, Anthony and Barnaby. We'd like to present you with a